Welcome to the stage our moderator, Paula Goldman, Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer, Salesforce, and panelists, Cindy Robbins, President and Chief People Officer, Salesforce, Brett Taylor, President and Chief Product Officer, Salesforce, Denise Dresser, EVP, Sales, Salesforce, and Mark Hawkins, President and Chief Financial Officer, Salesforce.
Wow, what incredible energy there is in this room. I'm so excited to be here today to moderate this panel on a really important topic, allyship, which is, I've been at Salesforce now for a couple of months. And I will say one of the things that has struck me the most is the frame around allyship. Because obviously, in truth, to solve any of the problems we're talking about, whether it's gender equality in the workplace or the representation of underrepresented minorities, we're all part of the solution. But I think sometimes we don't have ways to empower people to be part of the solution. So such an important conversation, and I want to dive in with that question, right? So at Salesforce, when we talk about allyship, we define it specifically. We don't just talk about it in abstract terms. It's about ask, listen, show up, and speak up. So let's dig into that. Can you guys, let's start reflecting on what does that mean? Can you give any examples of how any of those behaviors have manifested in your time at Salesforce?
Okay, you're looking at me.
Yeah.
Is this on? There you go. Can you hear me? Okay. I mean, I've been at Salesforce for 13 years, and I've had an interesting journey kind of going up the ranks during that 13-year tenure. I think for me, allyship has just gone through its own evolution. And I go back to my early days here at Salesforce, and the allies, the champions, the advocates that I had that helped me along the way, that was really needed for me. You know, yes, you do your job, you show up, but how I evolved as a leader was by listening, was by taking advice and counsel, was by earning trust, right? Forming those trusted relationships, that was really key. And there were a lot of people that helped me along the way, and 99% of them were men at Salesforce, because they were all in the position of power, but they took investment in me, which I appreciated that, and they saw some things in me. And I just think it is about showing up, it is about listening, it is about championing.
Yeah.
Championing to me is a key word around this, because we do need that. You know, all of us need that, whether you're championing a cause, or you're having someone champion your career, or you're championing other people's careers, right? And so for me, it's just been an evolution, because I've grown here as a leader, and then I had to think about, well, what is my responsibility now?
Right.
So those are the questions I keep asking myself, right? It's still an evolution.
Yeah, so let's build on that, because I think allyship is a particular responsibility if you're in a leadership position, right? So 4 top executives here from across the company, we all have particular responsibilities in the company. So how do you think about that? And maybe Mark, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, from my standpoint, first of all, this is an awesome event. I just want to call that out right away. It's impressive to see the energy and all the folks out there. To me, I feel like allyship is something that we all have to make a choice each and every day and make sure we don't miss the natural moments. And I think at Salesforce, that really is the kind of culture that empowers all of us to do that. I feel like as a leader, I think a real leader lifts people up, and they really persistently and consistently lift people up. And part of that is with mentoring. And I actually feel like going beyond mentoring, which is to be an advocate. And an advocate is a mentor in action, which is to not just mentor, but really advocate on a sustained basis. And we have that opportunity. And kind of like Cindy's discussion, I feel like people throughout my career have helped me persistently, and they've advocated persistently. And I feel like this is my chance to to pay it forward, but each one of us have had people that have helped lift us up and help us, think bigger and bring us into the room and that type of thing. So I think allyship is really keeping that in the forefront of your consciousness and not missing the natural opportunity and actually challenging yourself when you're not finding that you're doing something that is, really not just conceptually saying I'm bought in conceptually, but doing something, little things and big things. And that's what I think about it.
Okay, this is great. So let's. I think it's really helpful to get into some specific juicy stories here. And with that, I'm going to turn to Brett, because I understand that in your career, you have a really great story of allyship that involving Marissa Mayer. Can you tell us about that?
You're putting me on the spot here. So I started my career at Google and worked for Marissa the entire time I was there, so 4.5, 5 years. And it was interesting, there was this moment in my career where I got there and I had to prove myself through some smaller projects, and then I got a bigger project, which was a product that was sort of the precursor to Google Maps, which was a product I eventually launched. And I don't list the one preceded on my resume because it wasn't very successful. And it was interesting. So I had this moment where I was in a review with the executive team, reviewing sort of the results of a launch of that predecessor to Google Maps. And the executive team, and I won't name names, not embarrass them, they were really angry. So they were, typical bad meeting forms, sort of looking for blame, very frustrated with the outcomes, frustrated with the traffic, just people weren't using this product. And it was interesting because I saw Marissa, who had a lot of credibility at Google. She had started their consumer product group and ran it. Implicitly started taking the blame. Like, she didn't say it's my fault. She just started talking. Like, when the executives would say something bad, she'd say, "Well, we did this for this reason," and using phrases like "we." And it was interesting because I didn't really realize it until I left the room, but I was like, wow, that, like, if you were naive, you would have thought that, like, Marissa was involved in every single one of those product decisions, and she wasn't. It was me. It was, like, entirely my fault. And I don't even know if Marissa was conscious of it either. I think she just had that sense of team. That's like one of her best qualities. So I got out there and she wasn't happy with me, but she just came out. She's like, "Go fix this," And I was realizing, like, she gave me the air cover to go fix it. And so it was interesting because when I think of allyship, it's like, can you extend the credibility that you've gained to someone else that you believe in, or someone else who, due to perhaps the unconscious or conscious biases of people in the room, they're not given the same latitude that you are given to make mistakes. Can you extend your latitude to them? And it was interesting to me because in that case it was just sort of a hierarchical form of it, but it really impacted me. I was just thinking about that sort of success has 1,000 fathers, failure is an orphan. I think so much of what I've observed is how unevenly spread blame tends to be when projects go wrong. And your identity does come into play, whether or not we care to acknowledge it. And so I've tried to think about that. I wouldn't say I'm always perfect, no one is, but I think that's something that I really think about a lot, and that moment had a very big impact in my career.
Yeah, it's super interesting because so obviously the title of this panel is the role of male allies, and so let's dig into that a little bit. I think there's a common perception that it's sometimes men might feel uncomfortable in the role of ally, or that they'll feel uncomfortable navigating where they should and shouldn't tread. Let's talk about that a little bit. Like, what in both, and now I'm looking at you and I'm looking at Mark. In your work here at Salesforce, what do you feel, what have you done as the male ally? What do you feel is good practice?
Sure. I think the one thing that I really appreciate with my leadership team, and they have been totally committed, is again back to let's think about how to develop and evolve and actually do something, back to the earlier point. And we looked at our VPs and we looked at the population of our VPs in GBO Finance. And in 2014, we had 4 VP plus executives. And we thought, we can do better. We should do better. And the other thing is, you always think about it's all about the people you surround yourself by. That's true, but it's also to make sure that that's a diverse surrounding. And so we kept focusing on it. And I think one of the things we began to really challenge ourselves, and during the talent review, which we have every single 6 months, we do a talent review. Actually, Cindy's team is a great help to us. And we look at director and above all the way through every 6 months and saying, how is this progressing? And, where could people grow into in terms of succession planning as we go higher up? And so we've been doing that persistently and unprompted. And I'm really proud of the leadership team and their commitment to taking that time to do that. And in the end, today, we're up more than 3 times that number of VP plus folks in our organization. I'm really proud of that. In the sense, but it's more important is the process of making sure we're opening our minds and really, really thinking about that. But the other part of it, that I think to be an advocate and to be serious about it, is to be prepared to sacrifice. And be prepared to do things that are inconvenient when you're pushing people forward in their career and you're really supporting and really being serious about it. And having authentic dialogue with people where you're trying to give them good coaching, not coaching that says, by the way, I want you to stay on my team, right? I mean, and I got a lot of work to do, but we have 2 phenomenal executives. We tripled our numbers, and plus we had 2 what I call them alumni emeritus. Meredith Schmidt went into TMP, into Brett's team, and then another person I just have to think the world of is Lisa Edwards, working directly for Keith now with a huge responsibility. And that was not like really convenient, and I talked to Cindy, that was not like, let me just be really clear, and but on the other hand, it was so the right thing to do, and it's essential. And so I think those are the kinds of things you do when you're an ally, is do the right thing when no one's looking, push, and set goals in a sensible way. I didn't have like a number, or anything like that. It's just like, there should be more. And rightly so. And we have an awesome group of executives. So that's just one thought.
Yeah. One of the other amazing women leaders I worked with is Sheryl Sandberg when I was at Facebook. And she had this really interesting advice in the context of Lean In, which is to not presume what people's ambitions are, and to ask. It's really simple, but I did find her example was interesting. She was talking about, people not offering a job to someone who's pregnant because they presume that she might not want to travel. But that's a presumption. That's based on sort of a preconception of what mothers should do or should want to do or would want to do. So it was interesting. I just had this moment of this past year where one of the women on my team who I mentor, she was pregnant and wanted to pursue a different job, but she was going to wait until she came back from maternity leave. And then I was just sitting there thinking, like, I've read about this somewhere. And so I was just like, it was really interesting because it was an uncomfortable position, because in this case, she reflected her plan to me. So then I was like, okay, I don't want to be pushy, but I was like, okay, I'm just going to say it. I was like, do you want this job? Why aren't you going for it now? Why are you waiting until you come back? And she just said, well, I don't want to be disruptive to the team. I'm like, well, that's their problem, not your problem, and encourage her to take the job. And she did. And so it was interesting just because it is really uncomfortable, because it's like not my place. I don't understand her situation, but it's like, so that it's like a small moment of courage, but you're just like, okay, I'm just going to say it. I'm just going to ask the question. You just ask. And so that to me is that first of part of being an ally, like the ask is the hardest. And I think for me, just because I have a different vantage point in life, the most important, because it's the thing that like generates empathy, and I can actually understand people's individual situations as opposed to the presumption of what they want to do with their career.
That's really profound. And I know, Denise, I have so many questions for you. And I know you have a number of stories and then just an incredible journey here. I think there's probably a stereotype that sales is a hard place for women. So talk to me about that, and we talked a little bit about your story and kind of how a lot of people have been allies to you in your journey, right?
Yeah. So I think, I don't think sales is any harder for women than it is for men when you get there. But I think and we do not have enough women in sales in general. And I think when you look at the history of what sales was perceived to be, you can understand why. Because in the past, and I think there's this perception, is that sales is about traveling all the time, entertaining, unpredictable earnings, can't manage your schedule. And so I think that reputation has prevented a lot of women from even being interested in the past. And it just seems so unconventional if you want to also manage having a family or have people that you care for. And so I think that's probably the hardest thing, is that there's just this idea of what it is. And I think what I'm seeing and what I think is really encouraging is that as we think about how we work in our environment with customers, that's not how our job is. And we're changing that too, where it means that when we're doing things with customers, we're actually doing things with their family. And we're really changing the role so that we all want to be with our families. We all don't have a lot of time. And I think, to me, that's been really inspiring, to be a working mom in a field that is perceived to not be something that's as accommodating for people who also want to have a family, and being able to change that and bring in more women who are phenomenal at it. But the other thing is that your career takes journeys. It has sort of ebbs and flows, and it's not always linear. And I had that experience myself, and a long time ago now, 10 years ago, my older son had a learning disability, and I realized that I really needed to leave the workforce. And I was really scared at the time, because it was sort of that period of time where I thought, well, maybe this is it. Like, maybe I'm going to leave, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I knew I needed to be with my son. And I was so fortunate to have an ally and a mentor, a man that I worked for a really long time, who was great not only when I left, but also in staying in touch with me and helping me onboard back on. And I love that story for a couple of reasons. I did not know what was going to happen, and he was just such a great leader and advocated for me and stayed in touch. But I also think it's really important to recognize that the journey in your career takes different ebbs and flows. And I think particularly for women at times, it happens, and that's okay. And I think that thinking about how we bring in diversity and inclusion, being open-minded to that, to the ebbs and flows, that it's not linear, is a really important thing that has stood out for me, and that has inspired me to help other people through their journey. And it's okay, right? It's just okay. And I'm really thankful for that person who supported me, because it was a great opportunity for me to learn from him too.
Super interesting, and it's come up a couple of times. Yes, thank you. It's come up a couple of times, this question about supporting women, especially with respect to caregiving, right? Yeah. And periods of time where there might be more attention to that. But that can't be an issue that just affects women, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I almost wonder sometimes when we talk about this, it's like, well, okay, yes, so yes, obviously, if you're a male ally, be particularly sensitive to that.
Yeah.
But I also think it's incumbent on all of us to be sensitive to everyone that
Yeah.
and part of the journey towards equality is like, yes, if you're a man, if you're not a woman,
right.
and you have these needs, like, let's make that equally available.
Well,
right?
that's actually, so that was my experience this past year, because I felt like all of a sudden I was talking a lot about, and it's not just women who have families, right? There's other challenges, but the point being, I felt like we were talking a lot about women and trying to balance work and family. And then I thought, well, gosh, all these amazing men, my husband included, who's been a great ally, he wants to be with our kids too. And we really haven't acknowledged what I think is partly an underbelly of that, which is, as we build equality for everybody, that's also an opportunity for men to have an opportunity to be more involved with their family too. And I just want to commend a lot of men who've been really supportive. But I think the world is changing, and what work looks like is different, but it's creating opportunities for both men and women. And I think sometimes, I think men need to be recognized and also provided that opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So, and Cindy, as we talked about, Brett, it was particularly poignant when Brett talked about, like, oh, it's sometimes hard for us to ask, to have the courage to ask, and that's a first step. I know you've been doing a lot of work on psychological safety, and that's kind of how do we create the preconditions where people feel safe asking, and then people feel safe responding to the question. So talk a little bit about that. And in particular, I think for people in the room who want to be allies, whether it's on this issue or any issue, what can they do to create the safe space for these conversations?
Psychological safety is something my team and I have been researching for the last 2 years with influencers. Well, for one, Amy Edmondson, who coined the phrase. She's a Harvard Business School professor. And second are influencers like Brene Brown, who speaks a lot about courage, vulnerability, empathy. And when I think about psychological safety, and as I've talked to employees at all levels at Salesforce, it really comes down to, yes, the safe zone to speak up, but it's more about the conversation and the tone of the conversation. And whether you're the employee, you're the direct report, or you're the leader, I think for me, in my own leadership, I'm trying to ask myself questions around, am I giving them the right environment to have an authentic conversation so that they can ask questions and I can also ask questions. And this morning I talked about how the best advice my mentor gave me, which is you need to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And having these conversations can be very uncomfortable. So it's not just about, I think sometimes we center around giving hard feedback, which yes, that's part of it. But to me, that's kind of more tactical. The broader issue is around the conversation and then what happens after the conversation, right? Because I think once we feel we've put ourselves out there and and been authentic and took a courageous step in saying things that were uncomfortable, watching how our leader responds to it, then it's about also we're watching what are the actions after that, right? And so I think it is about that. I also think about it's at your peer level. You know, when we take risks, or if I take a risk, am I surrounded by peer level support, or do I feel like I'm isolated on an island? So that's also part of that psychological safety. You know, it kind of takes different forms at the peer level, at the colleague level, at the leadership level. But I do feel it's around that conversation and what are you doing to instill that environment to have that authentic conversation.
Right.
Because you really want the honest truth. And it can be very uncomfortable. But I feel like, for me anyway, the stress you carry kind of covering or masking, that's more exhausting.
For sure.
Than how I feel kind of exhilarated after I've had that honest conversation.
And there's the courage in asking, there's the courage in responding, and oh my goodness, for someone who feels like there's a problem, it is sometimes really hard to talk about it, right?
Oh yeah.
But then there's a third layer, right? Which is because if you're on the receiving end, I think there's a part of it that's like, how do you decouple this from something being a comment on your worth as a person versus there's an issue, we should respond to it, and there's a responsibility to respond to it. And I think that's also part of this question of safety.
Oh yeah.
And I guess I'm just, because I feel like this is super important, right? Like that how we all understand how to create the atmosphere for these conversations. So I'm really eager to hear from all of you on this.
Yeah, and I think there's an aspect of also empathy.
Yeah.
Right? And look, all these some of the conversations are not going to be good conversations. Some of the conversations are going to be about taking ownership, something didn't go right.
Yeah.
But you want to feel like there's some level of empathy and maybe forgiveness to move on.
Right.
Yeah, I also feel like in these moments, you talked about feeling supported by your peers. When someone's giving you hard feedback and you're receiving it, do you believe that they're trying to help you or not? And, you know, it's like, what's the motive, you know? And I feel like the best peers, the best mentors, the best bosses, the best employees who are trying to give you feedback, when they're speaking to you, you have that authentic feeling like, oh, they're trying to help, they're trying to produce something better at the other side of this. And I think that's the difference between feedback that feels petty or makes you defensive versus someone who's like trying to help you out. I feel like that trust and empathy is such a huge part of it, because the same message delivered by two different people with two different motivations can be received totally differently. And but I think a part of that too, which Cindy sort of hinted at, is like wanting to get that. And if you go in, with that mindset that it's like, I am not like set in stone as a person, and this isn't a personal reflection on me, just a way to improve, you'll also maybe perceive the same conversation differently as well.
I'd love to add on to that point. I totally agree with you, Brett. I have always tried to use a term in framing it to care enough to coach. I care about you enough to coach. And I think that it's back to really trying to connect and be real. This is not about trying to find a chink in armor. This is about, building people up and saying that this is important enough that we should have this dialogue, number one. And really do try to create an environment where people feel safe in those discussions and they can come back to those discussions. I also think the other side of it that you talked about is so important when we look for allyship, when we look for mentorship. All of us have been mentored in some form or fashion, is to be coachable. I'd heard one of the, a really well-known founder, was sharing some insights about what they learned, and they said the number one thing they look at is if they don't think somebody's coachable, and I think, Brett, you were saying not ready to receive something, that's the number one kind of danger sign, because what it says is you're atrophying your ability to grow in a world that's rapidly changing. So how do we make the magic of making all of ourselves coachable to be better, better, never done, and at the same time, be in an environment where somebody really does care enough to coach, and you can feel that emotional connection, and even if it's hard, even if you got to do better, you have to lift up. You can, I liked Marissa's, commentaries like, she's got your back, but go get this done. And I think that's really powerful. And if I might add just one small little thing that made me think when Brett's told me that story before, but what I think is that when we look for allyship, it may come in all the different directions that you're not expecting it. It might be a peer. It might be a manager. It might be somebody in higher different levels. It might just come from places that you're not expecting. But why don't we put ourselves in a position to take that from anybody, to lift us up? And I just think that that's really powerful. And it's like a mindset. It doesn't have to be, the top of the organization. The people who have helped me, I had mentioned, just before coming in to Paula, two female mentors for decades have helped me and have just helped me and grounded me. So why wouldn't I be an ally in equality to other people? I mean, I just want to have our consciousness be open to where that allyship could come from.
I think that's a really important point, because I think I'll speak for myself. It's easy to underestimate the power of a small gesture or a small comment to reach out when someone's in need or they could use a hand up. And I think it's very easy to assume we don't have power, right? So all of you are obviously in a position of authority, and you do have power to lift people up, but we all actually have that power. And I think it's really important to not underestimate that. So I know we've got a little bit of time left. Let's zoom out to the bigger conversation here. Salesforce has committed itself to gender parity. What can we do? What more do you think we can be doing to drive that goal here at Salesforce? And specifically, we talk about giving women a seat at the table. Any advice or thoughts about what we should be doing there?
Well, I obviously talk about this a lot. But I think if I could leave one thing is, yes, we're all trying to reach a goal. But it's really important when you're a woman and you're either moving up the chain or you're being rewarded or recognized, that you talk about why. And it's not viewed as a token. And I think that's really, really important because, as a woman, I want the conversation to be about, well, why did I earn X? Right? What is it that I did to earn X? Versus, we get caught up in the numbers a little bit, right? And for me, I think and I've grown up my entire life, I'm a underrepresented minority. And so I was always made to feel I was in a special category because there was a goal. But I want to know that I earned it. And that's really, really important to have that conversation versus it, yes, there is definite value in knowing your data. But for me, if I appeal to my male allies, it's remember to have that conversation as well, because that's really an important one.
I think that's a great, that is a great point. I also think part of what we can all do, and you said this, Mark, and I think all of us have echoed it, but is looking for people that maybe aren't raising their hand yet and being sensitive to where they are, of course, right? But asking. And I think some of the times there's this perception that it was a token, if it was a promotion or something like that. But the reality is they actually had been held back too long, and it's long overdue. And so something I'm trying to do is look around the organization and get to know more people and understand where more people want to be and what their career aspirations are. And what they want is really important, because you don't want to force anybody. But I just think there are more people that haven't had an opportunity because they've maybe been afraid to raise their hand. And we have to proactively look for those individuals, because there's incredible talent all across, not only just here at Salesforce, but in the world. And we just have to be more proactive about finding and creating the conversation and asking. And it's incredible what you learn about people and their journey and their story and what they're capable of if they're given an opportunity. We have to go find more people. It's just the truth. It takes work, and you have to just be committed to it.
I was going to say, what you just said resonates so much with me, because in my mind, you talk about the fact that we have a great deal of authority here, which is true. And I candidly, I just think that we need to hold leadership accountable for the change we expect to see. And it comes out because there's lots of these, despite a lot of talk that we do here in the technology industry in particular, the statistics have not gotten meaningfully better. They've gotten better, but not dramatically better. Not better in the way I think people in this room expect it to be. And it's in part because of leadership decisions, honestly, not just at our company, but across the industry. You hear things which sound like ostensibly reasonable excuses like, oh, there's pipeline problems. Well, really, that means that you've chosen time over quality. You've chosen to close a candidate at a particular time because you didn't want to spend the time to find a better pipeline. And I do think that when people say that, they're implicitly talking about a choice. And I do think that a lot of these things, there are a lot of leadership is defined by the moments when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable to make that choice. And I do feel like a lot of our representation problems, particularly in our industry, are because people aren't making hard decisions to find the best people. They're doing what is everyone else has done before, modeling the processes of successful companies that they've seen, which produced those outcomes, and we're expecting different outcomes from the same processes, which is entirely irrational. And so my sense is that that's the meaning of leadership is, do you make a choice to find better people by exploring a wider pool of candidates for every role? Are you willing to not close a candidate because you didn't view a pipeline that represented the types of people you want in that role? And I think so my sense is that we do need to hold leadership like us more accountable, because there are a bunch of implicit choices that I think we're given a pass on, I think too often.
Yeah.
And I would like to add on to that, I think all of us should ask ourselves, when we're committed to equality, how much time, and I think I like the narrative, Brett, about pipeline, but how much time are we spending, even when we're not hiring, constantly meeting people? Again, Cindy's team's helping me. I asked for monthly meeting of people that I've never met before, inside and outside of the company, to try to invest and get way in front, to try to begin to make progress on things, I think is really important, and make those investments in time. I wanted to throw one other thought out that the question hasn't come out, and I really like the whole thing, Paula, about how do we get more people at the table. But I want to say one other thing, is I want to encourage each and every person, when somebody's at the table, just know you belong. Always tell yourself you belong, and just be your true self and let it go, and just give your best. And I really think that that's important sometimes, because people get it to the table and, should I be at the table? Is it okay? My mentoring is, if you're at the table, you're at the table. And just don't let anybody talk you into any kind of nonsense that is different. So.
Beautiful. So let's drive this home, because we've heard a lot of really good stuff here about having the courage to ask, taking the time and making deliberate choices, and owning the choices that you're making about these issues. Also about being conscious about looking for people who may not be speaking up. So which one of you wants to drive this home? What advice do you have for people in the room who are looking to be better allies? I'll call on
Show up.
Go ahead.
Show up. Just show up. Just, I think you said it earlier, Brett, and I think it's true. The hardest part is sort of asking, right? And opening yourself up. And I think that I have learned this over time myself. I was always afraid to say the wrong thing or ask the wrong question. But I found so many times people are actually as gracious to me when you don't know, but if you show up and you care and you begin the discussion. And I think that's really important. And it's an easier thing to do than people maybe think. But it has a huge impact.
Very well said.
I would just build on that and say, conceptually, you're there, and each and every day ask yourself, what am I doing from concept to reality every single day? How can I help today? Not tomorrow, not a week from tomorrow, not after financial close, not whatever your workload is. How do I help today? That's what I would say.
Perfect. And I think that's a great way to end this panel. We're so fortunate to have leaders like you to help us blaze this trail. And please give everyone a round of applause. Thank you.